Hi. Okay, this is the class Korean Government and Politics, and this recorded lecture is for the date officially of September 23rd. That is the Thursday, the day following the Chuseok holiday of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'm recording this recording. Okay, that's good. I'm making this recorded lecture so that you don't have to come to school and you don't have to tune in to Zoom at a certain time on the day after a 3-day holiday that immediately follows a 2-day weekend. That makes a 5-day holiday. Because I know quite a few students would like to have a 9-day holiday. That is Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday and Friday, and of course the following Saturday, Sunday. So we're doing this as a recorded lecture. As it says at the top of this page, 9/23, September 23rd, Korea, the Six Republics, Introduction. So at the beginning of the semester, we're doing a broad overview of a number of topics, and most of these topics we will come back to a little bit later in the semester with some digging down, some getting more details. But for today, the Six Republics, we're doing a general and kind of a little bit more legal historical overview. That is, what does the paperwork say about these six republics? So let's not talk about politics too much because there's deeper passions about these politics. We're just going to do a historical overview. Now, everything I'm going to talk about is on this one CTL page, which you can access freely anytime. And a simpler version of this information was presented in our second class meeting, I think. So what we'll see here is more detail and more discussion about it. And I also provide some links. And I'm not sure those links are going to work while I'm recording. I think they do, and I can show you. But of course, when you're watching a video, you can't click on the links. But you can always go back to the original CTL page to click on the links. So, as I mentioned in the class of September 16th, the modern nation of Korea identifies its foundation with the government that was in Shanghai in China, which officially is called the Korean Provisional Government. And that government was basically a kind of a government in exile, or they like to claim that they were. That government in exile, E-X-I-L-E, makes it sound like we're the true government, but we've been pushed out of the country. But we're the true government. So whether we say that the Joseon government ended and Japanese colonization began, whether we say that happened in 1905 or 1910 or 1915, isn't really important for our discussion today. And one of the reasons why it's hard to say when Joseon ended is because, in fact, the prince who was heir and who became, in a way, kind of the next king, was taken to Japan, raised in Japan from a young boy. So the Japanese colonial government could always claim that they were working on behalf of the youthful prince. this kind of a governing, it's called a regency in classic talk. This kind of governing for a young king is it's classic, it's normal, it's usual in Europe and in Korea. So that was one of the legs that this Japanese colonial government stood on, this idea that they were actually governing for the prince. Now I'm going to stop this video for a second and I'll come back, but I'm going to stop it to make sure that all the audio is working because I'm doing something different. Anyway, the contemporary government likes to pretend that the Japanese government was not our history, but the provisional government is our history. And this is actually inside the Korean Constitution. So, in 1919 we had the Korean Provisional Government. And let's see if this link works. Ta-da! Looks like it does. Now, my links are to Wikipedia. And the downside of Wikipedia, of course, is that anybody can change it. And sometimes things get changed back and forth because there are competing factions, competing groups of people who think something should be right or wrong. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We can see it's a Wikipedia page. We can see that on the Wikipedia page there are various markings. We can see the traditional flags, etc., etc. Now, again, you can feel free to look at this as you wish. But it does provide a lot more detail than I need to. And it does provide the kind of detail where you don't need to buy a textbook. Again, one of the elements of history is who writes the story. There can be competing stories. Which textbook do you buy? Which author wrote it? Can all make differences. So let's go back to our other page, and we're somewhere like that. Sorry, I know that makes you a little drunk when you watch the video, but web pages don't match. So anyway, you can read more about the Korean Provisional Government. I won't speak too much about it. You can see this paragraph's very short. The foundation of the Republic of Korea. Well, the original Korean government will not recognize the American military administration and will not recognize the Japanese colonial government. So, in effect, this provisional government ran from 1919 until 1948, until the end of the U.S. military administration government, KMAG. Okay, and we can see it formed shortly after the March 1st movement. As I mentioned, Koreans tend to identify their historic events by the dates. This was the event where numerous Koreans protested against Japan, and a number of notable protesters were killed. Generally, they were beaten before they were killed. They were killed publicly. This was a time when the Japanese were not tolerating dissent. The Japanese colonial administration, their legal enforcement, their toleration for dissent went up and down. It raised and it lowered across time. But 1919 was a time when they just simply wouldn't put up with things. All right, so the key members in the establishment of the Korean Provisional Government included An Chang-ho and Syngman Rhee. We will hear about both of these people in events across the next 30, 40, even 50 years. Leading members disagreed on how the Korean government should be managed, the trusteeship. Okay? So inside this provisional government, we had the very far left, absolute Marxist communists, people who believed in the Bolshevik red revolution of Russia, and those who were extreme, far right, conservative, absolutely hated anything communist, but they were all nationalists. They all believed that Korea should be an independent country. Okay? The left was pretty much led by somebody who wasn't extreme left, a center-left politician, Ryu Un-hyung. Now, over time, Romanization, the English writing for Korean names, changed a lot, and individuals can write names their own way. But Ryu. And the right was led by, again, a center-right, somebody not too extreme, Kim Gyu-sik, another name we will hear about for the years and years ahead. But anyway, despite their differences of opinion on what kind of government, what kind of society should be in the future, they agreed to cooperate because whatever their differences, they were Korean and the Japanese were not Korean. Ultimately, finally, again, this provisional government had zero authority. They had nobody in Korea to enforce any rules they might make. They basically were more like cheerleaders, what we want, and giving people in Korea a reason to believe in the future through their secret messages. Okay, in our last face-to-face class on December 16, we talked about the Japanese colonial government just about as much as we need to. We don't really need to talk much more about the Japanese colonial government. We will talk about some of the influences, the effects of the Japanese colonial government. But right now, well, we don't really need to talk about them. So I guess we won't. I'm just checking time. It's about 13 minutes so far. So let's get to the First Republic. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier class, Korea lists or enumerates, numbers their governments according to constitutional change, just as France does. If you look at the United States, well, there have been minor amendments to the United States, but there hasn't been a whole-scale change. The United States is still on its first constitution. Sort of, because in fact there was a different kind of constitution for about 10 years and it didn't work very well and they kind of threw it out and started it over again. But Americans don't like to talk about that. The First Republic, well, the president was Syngman Rhee. Why? Because the Americans liked him, as we mentioned in a previous class. And this First Republic claimed to be the government over the whole peninsula, just as the government in North Korea claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula. Okay, now be careful about the word sovereignty, because in our last class I talked about the word suzerain and suzerainty. Sovereign is that independence, that we have the right to govern ourselves. Suzerain means we are under somebody else and we have lost some of our autonomy and authority. Suzerain and sovereign. Okay, so the First Republic claimed the entire peninsula, but only held power south of the 38th parallel. The line that was drawn by basically Russia and the United States when the Japanese left is pretty much close to the line that exists today after the Korean War, 1950-1953. Pretty much the same. The border was modified a little. A few islands shifted hands, a few places where the line is not perfectly straight. We generally call it the 38th parallel, but I think only about half of the line is pretty close to the global 38th parallel, and the other parts bend and twist and reflecting the natural geography. As it happened, one of the major provinces of the unified Korea and how Japan managed it was Gangwon province, and we still talk about Gangwon-do in the south, but North Korea also has Gangwon-do. So that province was split. The First Republic was led by Syngman Rhee, who was pretty much appointed by the United States. There was a kind of an election, but, well, not democracy at its finest. And because he kind of inherited the government from the military, U.S. military, and because he was probably, at that point, more American than Korean, living in U.S. so long, basically, his government just continued what the U.S. military government had done. It was very, very anti-left, very, very anti-communist, anti-socialist. We could say harshly, in that the army and the police regularly went out to look for, capture, beat, and kill people that it said were communist. That includes the Jeju Uprising of 1948. And there's lots of stories about that, and I welcome you to read more about that. People in Jeju feel very strongly about that. People in other places say it didn't happen. There's also the Bodo League Massacre. Lots of people were killed. This was actually during the Korean War. And the numbers are extreme. Somewhere between 100,000 people and 1,140,000 people were executed. Just killed. And again, we can visit a Wikipedia site to see more about that. The First Republic ended in a kind of, it's not democracy. It is demonstration. It is social social unrest, social upheaval, where there were no students carrying guns telling the president to get out. It didn't work like that. It was just that there was so much protest that basically other government officials and some military leaders told Syngman Rhee, you need to leave. It's not safe for you here anymore. And so Syngman Rhee got on a plane. And he flew to Hawaii. Well, Hawaii was not so terribly far. We didn't have jets in those days. And in fact, Syngman Rhee spent most of his remaining life in Hawaii. The Second Republic, well, they created a new constitution because they thought that the presidency of Syngman Rhee had too much power in the president. Now, this is a theme we will revisit in the future. How much power should the president have? So in this Second Republic, Yoon Bo-sun became president. But in this form of government, the president was head of state, kind of like the Queen of England. The head of state is the person who goes and cuts the ribbons with a new bridge, appoints various officials, approves appointments from the prime minister, but doesn't have a lot of power. In some governments, the head of state is also kind of head of diplomacy, can control foreign affairs. Not so much in the Second Republic. And Jang Myeon became the prime minister. And in this form, the prime minister is head of government, just like in the UK, where he has almost all the political power He leads the administration, theoretically, officially leads the army. Even though the head of state might be, on paper, the chief general, the actual authority over the army comes from the head of government. But what you'll see is that the dates kind of flop around here. We've got Yun Bo-sun, 1960, Chang Myan, 1960-61. Because the process of change was not smooth, it was a new constitution. Yun Bo-sun took over as president immediately before there was a new constitution. When Syngman-rhee left Lee Seung-man, somebody had to be president. So there was these transitions, and it made things a little confusing. But as we can see, the Second Republic ended Rhee's authoritarianism and repression. They formed a different kind of government, which was called a liberal democracy. Now the challenge is that liberal democracy means different things to different people. And in the Constitution today, Korea is defined as a liberal democracy, yet we hear people, politicians, arguing about what that means. This Second Republic also started with five-year plans, something that's very famous in communist-type governments. You don't hear it too much in more liberal economies where governments don't interfere with the economy too much. But the first five-year plan was created. Why? Because the economy was nothing. In 1960, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. Philippines was kind of middle of the world, middle of the table. Philippines has gone down since then. Korea was down at the bottom of the economic charts in terms of GDP, GNP, whatever you want to measure. Koreans were hungry. Okay? There was nothing here. When the Japanese were managing this country, most of the heavy industry was in the north because there's coal in the north. There is iron in the north. There is water falling from mountains which can create hydroelectric electricity in the north. Heavy industry was mostly in the north. The south was more for farming. Well, in the north, the weather's colder. The growing seasons are shorter. So it made sense. So that in 1960, the economy was better in North Korea than it was in South Korea. So they needed to make economic plans to improve the country. However, despite plans, things didn't work very well. Okay, they only had a couple of years. A five-year plan needs at least 5 years, right? At least 4. But really the country wasn't very successful. People didn't see success. The Second Republic government tended to blame the army for lots of the things that had happened during the Lee Seung-man time, the Syngman-rhee time. And there was a lot of corruption in the army. And so a lot of high-ranking officers were punished, kicked out. And the army didn't like this. They went from being one of the leading forces in government to being the whipping child. People who were blamed for everything. So as we can see, the Second Republic featured a series of purges, kick out military and police officials who had been involved in anti-democratic activities. The Second Republic was much more liberal, much more friendly to communism. And basically, as we see governments around the world, when a more liberal government comes in, they criticize the prior conservative government. When a more conservative government comes in, they blame the more liberal government. We still see this in Korea. Every single president in Korea has gone to jail after their presidency, except one who killed himself before he went to jail. So Were they actual criminals, or is that part of how politics works? I don't know, but I don't want to be president in Korea. Sorry. It ends badly. Okay? But we can see that more than 2,000 government officials and more than 4,000 police officers were purged, kicked out of their job. So the Second Republic ended with a coup d'etat. The military came in and told these government officials, you're out. Now, nobody was killed. There were a few minor incidents, but basically it was entirely peaceful. Bak Chung-hee was a major general in the army who had been purged and rehabilitated, brought back. Bak Chung-hee had been a low-ranking officer in the Japanese colonial army in Manchuria, which they called Manchukuo. Okay, the Japanese used Korean soldiers and low-ranking officers in Manchuria in their conquering and controlling. They didn't use so many Koreans in Korea because they might not be loyal. This is a classic procedure. We see that, for example, the Scots people were troublesome to the English king, and they were poor. And they weren't quite the right religion. They were Christian, but a little different. So they gave them land in Ireland because the Irish were Catholic and the Irish were more trouble. So they took these Presbyterian, this one kind of Protestant, and gave them free land in Ireland. Now these Scots, who had been difficult, not very pleased with the English government, needed the English government to protect them from Irish. They became good English or good British because they got benefits and they needed help. So in the same way, the Japanese would take Koreans and give them opportunities, but not in Korea, in another country. And Bak Chung-hee is a classic example of that. Kim Jong-pil was a lieutenant colonel, much lower. He had also been pushed out and kind of rehabilitated. And these guys were pushed out not so much because they were corrupt, but because they objected to the process. They said, this is not right. You are being unfair. This is how it's always been. You're punishing us under new rules for what was normal in the old rules. Okay, the military in general were opposed to what they called liberation aristocrats. That is, these people who had this kind of royal life in the exile government, in the provisional government, they had not suffered with the Koreans under the Japanese. And they had not worked for Korea, even though technically they were working for Japan in Manchukuo. They felt like, we have suffered and we have worked hard, and you guys, you never worked hard. You just kind of lived a lovely life, and now you come in and tell us what to do. We didn't like Syngman Rhee. We didn't like Yun Po, any of these other guys. Get out. So they took over the country and they announced in the newspapers and on radio, no TV then, what they were doing in this coup, the objectives. And here we go. Anti-communism, closer ties with the United States, eliminating political corruption, developing a national economy, an autonomous economy, not just dependent on gifts from other countries. A goal is Korean unification. That's always a good goal. Every Korean will say, yeah, it's a good idea. And removal of the present generation of politicians. all those guys that have been destroying our country for the last 13 years, 48 to 63, 15 years. We're going to get rid of all of them. Okay, so now we get some details. The process of how it happened. I don't need to read all that. You can read it. Basically, there were several steps. They created a kind of a temporary council that then became a more permanent council that led to a kind of a national assembly that the military could control, and that way they could formally, legally, under a new constitution, elect a new president. What we note here is that there were power struggles. Ultimately, Park Chung-hee took over power. So there was a time when he was one of the leaders, but not the face of the revolution. And there are many who say that Kim Jong-pil, that lieutenant colonel, not a general, was the actual brains, and in some respect kind of the commander in the early days. All right, so in 1963, after this transition, right, there was the Second Republic, then there was this revolution, and it took a while before we got a new constitution written. The new constitution started in 1963. Park Chung-hee was president. We've got a Wikipedia page that gives us more. So the Third Republic started when the military junta, the military organization that was managing the country, officially dissolved. Why did that happen? Well, one story is that the United States was pushing Park Chung-hee and this military government to open up, to produce democracy. The United States had fought for South Korea to maintain democracy against those evil communists. So now that we have a dictator, well, we're happy that you're anti-communist, but where's the democracy? Where's the democracy? So there was an election. A referendum, which means let's ask the people if they agree. It's not exactly a perfect election. A referendum was sent out to the public to ask, do you agree to return to a presidential system? And supposedly 78% of the people approved it, but there were problems with that election. So now we have the idea that there should be a president. Now we have an election. So Park Chung-hee had to stop being a general so that he could run for president. He ran. He won. Not by a lot. He ran against Yoon Bo-sun and some others. As I mentioned in an earlier class, you will see this name Yoon Bo-sun written various ways. Maybe with a P. Maybe with no E. Romanization. Even in my own paperwork, I just follow mostly I follow the typing of where I got stuff. So, officially, technically, the Third Republic was a civilian government, that is, not controlled by military. And that this government was somehow under the National Assembly. Well, is the president under the assembly, or is the president elected under the power of the assembly? Lots of countries do things differently. But in fact, it was pretty much the same old boys who had controlled the government as military. The good point is this government had a primary focus of developing the economy of the country. And still today, you'll find old people who will tell you that Park Chung-hee is a national hero because he developed the country. By the time his presidency ended, he was assassinated, he was killed. But by the time his presidency ended, the country had turned upside down. In a good way. In 1960, almost everybody was a farmer, almost everybody was hungry. The benefit they had was that many of those farmers owned their land. That was a transition from the Japanese government. And we'll talk more about farm development in a couple weeks. So the economy changed from mostly agrarian farming into factory workers, from the countryside into the growing cities. People had money, maybe not enough, but they saw their life was much better than their fathers, and they envisioned and believed that their children's job future would be better than their own. So the country was improving economically, and people in that time, in the late 60s and the 70s, were willing to accept maybe a loss of democracy in exchange for not being hungry, in exchange for economic improvement. Now younger people, younger can be 40-year-olds today, question that logic. But the older people, you talk to 70-year-olds in Korea, almost all of them are huge fans of Park Chung-hee, especially in this region. In 1967, Park Chung-hee was re-elected. Yoon Bo-sun, here we have it with a B again. Again, right? Park was elected. Yoon Bo-sun lost. Yoon Bo-sun was appointed by the New Democratic Party. Now, these party names mean nothing. Later in the semester, we will try to trace parties. And you'll see that the name Democratic doesn't mean anything. Both sides use that name. So, excuse me. Just recognize that Park was more conservative and Yoon Bo-sun was more liberal, leaning closer to a socialist or communist approach. Now, the Constitution at the time only allowed somebody to become president for 2 5-year terms. We have to change the Constitution. So the National Assembly, which was dominated by the military and Park Chung-hee's fans, because of how the elections were managed, the National Assembly approved a constitutional amendment. Now here's a key point that we'll talk more about later. But in some countries, amending or changing the Constitution is very easy. And in some countries, it is extremely difficult. In the United States, constitutional amendment is extremely difficult. A fast constitutional amendment is like 2.5 years. But often it takes 10 or 15 years of arguing and votes here and votes there and votes here to change the Constitution. But in Korea, it's easy. So the National Assembly changed the Constitution to allow Park Chung-hee to run for office a 3rd time. And he was re-elected in 1971. Later that year, Park Chung-hee declared a state of emergency. He suspended the Constitution. He suspended many of the laws. In that announcement, which was on radio, he announced plans for Korean unification. He made a joint communique, or he said there was a joint communique with North Korea in July 1972. So he said it was going to happen in 1972, supposedly going to happen. Well, that's a big change in life, and a lot of people were excited. So again, Park Chung-hee was kind of getting people let it slide. People said, well, things are getting better, so well, it's not exactly right, but well, okay. So now the dates kind of float around here. It's interesting. It's hard to get anybody to say anything the right way. But in October of 1972, Park threw out the Constitution. Okay. Previously, he had suspended the Constitution, to freeze it. But then he threw it out. Basically, he told all the National Assembly members, "You're fired. Go home. Get out." And he declared martial law. That means the military is the law. The military will tell the police what to do. Universities were closed. Media, such as newspapers, radio, and television, were censored. And speech was restricted. Park called for the writing of a new constitution, which was written in 2 weeks and approved by this emergency state council, which was taking the place of the National Assembly. So this new constitution was called the Yushin Constitution. And there's lots of ways to translate it. Shin generally means something like new. And Yu sounds something like that which exists. So Yu Shin would be to rejuvenate, to bring back to life, or to revitalize, to bring back to life, or to reform, or to renew. And this new constitution gave the president extreme autocratic powers. It erased any rules about presidential term limits, and elections were extended to every 6 years. Basically, it made Park Chung-hee president for life with complete power. At this point, an electoral college was created. Electoral college, we have it in America. Okay, so it's not quite fair to say it's perfectly wrong, but the electoral college says no, citizen votes do not elect the president. If 8,531,000 vote for Mr. A and 7,987,000 vote for Mr. B, Mr. A wins. That's pure democracy. But in an electoral college, people vote for their representative, and their representative votes. Just like we have a National Assembly, each assembly person represents a group of people, and then in the assembly, those assembly people make a choice. Okay, so in 1972, the Yushin Constitution was approved. That's interesting, typing error. With 92.3% of the vote. 91% of the people voted, and 92% of the votes were in favor. Can we really believe this? There is no way this was true. But that was the news. And that officially eliminated the Third Republic that Park Chung-hee had started and created the Fourth Republic that Park Chung-hee started. The Yushin government. Okay, now remember, Park Chung-hee is a autocrat, dictator. He can do anything he wants now. And one of the first things they did was kidnap Kim Dae-jung. Kim Dae-jung became president of Korea in 1998, elected in 1997. But he was a competitor. He was a spokesperson for democracy, let's say. He often spoke against Park Chung-hee. He ran in election against Park Chung-hee. So the Korean CIA, and they called it the KCIA, which was managed by Kim Jong-pil, remember, the lieutenant governor who was the mastermind of the 1962-1963 acts. Kim Jong-pil arranged for Kim Dae-jung to be kidnapped in Tokyo, not in Korea, but in Tokyo. Park Chung-hee also kicked out Kim Young-sam from the National Assembly. Well, Kim Young-sam also became a president in the future. Ultimately, the Fourth Republic ended not too long after President Park Chung-hee was assassinated by his lifelong friend, Kim Jae-gyu. Kim Jae-gyu, at that point, had become chief of the KCIA. Various discussions will also say that Kim Jae-gyu was chief of security for the president. Okay, so the president's dead. What happens? Well, the way the design was, the prime minister, who had very little power, became the replacement. But the army was running the show. So they declared martial law, they appointed somebody else as chief. Chun Doo-hwan then took charge of things and took charge of the KCIA, and over time, Chun Doo-hwan led a coup d'etat. So again, we had these transitions with actually 3 or 4 official leaders between Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, but ultimately Chun Doo-hwan became leader under a coup d'etat. Again, as is normal in every country in the world, the army comes in and says, we are protecting the country from dangerous elements. These politicians are risking the country. We need to rescue society. Very ordinary. So, Chun Doo-hwan launched the coup d'etat. The Fourth Republic didn't fit Chun Doo-hwan's idea of what should be, so Chun Doo-hwan arranged for a new constitution, and in the new constitution, Chun Doo-hwan became president. That created the Fifth Republic. So the Fourth Republic was the Yushin, 1972. The Fifth Republic was the Chun Doo-hwan government. And in this case, the president could only run for one time. It was a 7-year presidency. So we've gone from a 5-year term to a 6-year term. 5 years and could be president 2 times, total 10, to 6-year but unlimited, to now 7-year but single term. Okay, Chun Doo-hwan was elected president. It was on the electoral college system where citizen votes are not direct. And who's in the electoral college? Well, the government kind of controls that. The Fifth Republic started heading towards its end in the next student uprising in 1987, the June Democracy Movement, where citizens were saying, no, we're hearing rumors that Chun Doo-hwan wants to change the government to allow himself to run again. No, we're not going to accept that. We want to see more citizens' rights. We want to see more democracy. And Chun conceded. And basically, he set up a system for a new constitution with his loyal assistant, another former soldier, another former general, No Tae-woo, to succeed him. And this is important because Chun understood that if No Tae-woo was president, Chun wasn't going to be attacked. He wasn't going to be going to jail or killed or forced to pay money, because his friend was his successor. But the government design, the Constitution did change. So we can see that in the Sixth Republic, we went back to direct popular election. If 35 million people vote, we find out who got the most votes from that 35 million, and that becomes president. So No Tae-woo was the chosen candidate. Once again, we had a competitor, Kim Dae-jung, who was kidnapped and almost killed. Kim Young-sam, who was kicked out of the legislature. 2 guys who had fought against Park Chung-hee, politically fought, not military fought, ran for president at the same time as No Tae-woo. There were 3 main candidates. No Tae-woo did not win by much. If either Kim Young-sam or Kim Dae-jung had not run, if they had unified their vote, probably most of those people would have voted for them. No Tae-woo would not have been elected. This was a tough election, but it was to the advantage of the military to encourage Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung to run and to compete and to split that vote. Okay, so with the preparation for the handover from Jeon Do-hwan to No Tae-woo, a new constitution was created. That is the same constitution until today. There have been some minor changes, but the basic constitution is the same. That is the Sixth Republic. And we can see the presidencies. The presidencies. No Tae-woo, Kim Young-sam. I put a note in here about the Asian financial crisis. This was taking place at the end of the Kim Young-sam government during the time of election for the next presidency. Kim Dae-jung was elected president and inherited a disaster. Okay? And part of that is probably that the Kim Young-sam government was trying to hide the problem, doing little kind of fixes that didn't solve the problem but kind of hid it, kind of masked the problem, but in fact it makes things worse. Kim Young-sam didn't want to admit that his presidency was ending with an economic crisis. Kim Dae-jung came in, he inherited the crisis. Kim Dae-jung was the first president who came from the left. He's not a communist, but clearly much more Democrat than No Tae-woo or Kim Young-sam. In fact, Kim Young-sam was kind of the hand-chosen candidate from the No Tae-woo government. The No Tae-woo government had a political party, and they invited Kim Young-sam into their party and told him, you'll be our candidate, but you kind of have to accept these things, these principles of ours. Some of our staff are going to be some of your staff. Kim Young-sam accepted that. So in a way, he was democratic, but he was still tied to the previous governments in some respects. That's something that is carried through on his history. Right? Now, I said earlier that every president went to jail. Technically, Kim Young-sam didn't go to jail. His son did. His son did. They investigated Kim Young-sam. They investigated his family. Kim Young-sam technically didn't go to jail. His son did. It was kind of a second-hand way to attack him. Kim Dae-jung didn't go to jail after his presidency because he was succeeded by another liberal, another leftist, No Moo-hyun. And basically, by the time we got to the Lee Myung-bak government, Kim Dae-jung had passed away. So when I say every president went to jail, that's not exactly true. But every president sooner or later got investigated, and almost all of them went to jail, except for two who basically died before the prosecution got to them. Kim Dae-jung was protected by the next government, and No Moo-hyun fell off a mountain. We say fell off the mountain because it's understood by most people that he committed suicide. But there are some who believe that there were people who pushed him off the mountain because there were certain secrets that they didn't want known. Korea has this cultural idea that a person will kill themselves to protect those around them. So, as an example, when No Moo-hyun was found dead, the investigation into his family, his wife, his children was stopped. And of course, the investigation of No Moo-hyun himself stopped because he's dead. What's the point? One more thing to notice here is that this guy, No Tae-woo spelled with an N, and Ro Moo-hyun spelled with an R, this family name and this family name is the same family name. It's written in Korean with a lil and an o. It's that idea of romanization, just like Singman Ri. We go back up here. We say Singman Ri, Ri. Where did he go? Where did he go? Singman Ri writes his name R-H-E-E. But another person would write it as L-E-E. One more point about names. Sometimes the name looks the same in Korean, but the Chinese character for that family name is different. There's more than one kind of Li. So that has really nothing to do with how they spell their name in English. It's just background information that just because somebody is a Li doesn't mean they're actually writing their name in the Chinese characters the same way. It's actually not the same name, even though in Korean it's spelled the same. Even though in English it might be spelled the same name. So be careful with these names, that you understand that these are simply romanizations. It is this guy's choice how he wants to write his Korean name in English. And that the Korean writing of a name is not the true name. The true name is the Chinese writing for the name. And finally, this also explains partly why the Koreans had to take Japanese names. Because Koreans use Chinese writing for their family names, almost all of these Chinese writing for a family name can be pronounced in Japanese. So therefore, I don't know the words. I'll give an example. Example, a Mr. Park could be a Mr. Yamaguchi. Now, of course, it doesn't sound the same at all. But that Chinese writing is said Yamaguchi in Japanese. So people didn't freely adopt Japanese names. They were supposed to use the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese character for their family name. As for given names, fewer Koreans use Chinese characters for given names nowadays. So the name is Kim Min-ju. Well, Min-ju are very common Chinese characters. And actually Min-ju translates, in one way, you can translate Min-ju as democracy. So the Korean Minju-dang is the Korean Democratic Party. But we can use Min in other ways, and we can use Ju in other ways. You've probably heard of soju, the alcohol, Mekju, the alcohol. That Ju is relating to alcohol. That's not the same as when we have somebody's name Min-ju. It's a different Ju. It's a different Chinese character. Anyway, so Kim Dae-jung and No Moo-hyun came from the left party, which we can roughly call the Democrat Party. And then there was a transition. The Lee Myung-bak government was from the conservative, which I typically call Hana Rodang, but we can use other names. The Conservative Party. Park Geun-hye from the Conservative Party. Her term was shorter because she was impeached. The Moon Jae-in government, Moon Jae-in, back to the liberals, was elected to finish that term. And he has a 5-year term. And so what that means is the schedule for elections is a little different. Okay? We're going to have an election in 2012. Park Geun-hye only had a 4-year presidency. A little bit less, and then there was a transition. So those are the republics up to now. And I've hit roughly my time limit. We're at roughly 60 minutes for this lecture. I'll be happy to take any questions in our next class on Monday after the Chuseok holiday. Where are we? Just a second, let me point to it. Okay, so I don't have the lecture materials for the next class up yet. That's part of my job. It's 10 days from now. I have several other classes to record. But the Monday class, here's the game. I mentioned it in the class September 16th. The official school rule is that there are no Zoom classes from Wednesday, September 29th. But we have class Monday, September 27th. But I've recorded this class for you for the Thursday. And what my rule is that I will not Zoom on Monday, September 27th. I will not Zoom on September 27th. However, it is possible that the health situation, the COVID situation, will change between now and then. If it changes, if I need to do a Zoom, then I will put that information in the notice board. I will provide that information. Anything can change, we don't know. But right now, the rule is everybody in the classroom Monday, September 27th. We're not going to wait until the Thursday of that week. There's no point. There's no reason. I have been teaching in the classroom all along. The only difference is you don't have the option to Zoom. Okay, and that's everything. Now, if you have questions, don't be shy to contact me. You should have my Kakao information, and you should have my phone information. If you don't see it, if you click on the 강의 계획서, the syllabus up there at the top, you'll find my email address. You'll find my Kakao ID. My office phone number isn't going to help you very much. So here at the end of this video, let me type my cell phone number in case you don't have it. Zero 22720968. I know that's not very big. It's there. I'll put it up on the notice board if it's not already there. Okay? 01022720968. Don't save. Yeah, I'll put a notice up right after this video. Okay? Long enough for today. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the classroom, hopefully Monday, September 27th. Bye-bye.